the other thing, and this is incredibly tactical, but it comes up in almost every conversation I have, which is just basic meeting hygiene and just keeping meetings really focused, on point, like agenda driven, knowing what you want to say, knowing what you want to get out of it, and keeping because meetings are really like how we interact on like a daily basis. Most people hate them, but a really good meeting can create so much, such a great sense of connection and community and the sense of forward progress. Because I think ultimately that's what leaders want, is a sense of momentum, and that we're growing, we're moving, we're doing things, opportunities are being created. And that's what you can do in a really well run meeting. So I think kind of getting some discipline around how they run meetings is a good tactic as well.
Welcome to the People Powered Solutions podcast. In this show, you'll gain expert advice and tips on building a thriving workplace culture with happy employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be spending this time with you today. Hello, and welcome to another episode of People Powered Solutions podcast. Today, we welcome a fellow ally in the workplace transformation, in the culture realm. We welcome Robin, who does a lot of the similar work that our company does, who is also extremely passionate about improving the employee experience and creating highly motivating, highly engaging workplaces. Welcome, Robin.
Well, Lori, thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here and have the opportunity to speak with you and with your audience, and I'm looking forward to it.
I'm also looking forward to just deep diving right in. But before we start, I always say I'm a little uncomfortable reading a bio. There's this awkward moment as a podcast host where you're reading a bio and your guest is sitting there awkwardly hearing themselves spoken of in the third person, essentially. So instead, if I can get you to introduce yourself with your full name so people can find you, but rest assured, folks, we'll have all that in the show notes and all the links to connect with Robin after the fact. So your full name, and then tell us a little bit more about how Robin got to doing what Robin does.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, so I am Robin Camarote. I am a leadership development trainer and an executive coach. And I came to this work after many, many years of being in management consulting and kind of climbing that corporate ladder, ending up in a senior management position, probably before I was really ready for it, making all the mistakes and kind of learning the hard way. And just committing at a point probably 10 or 12 years ago that I really had to figure out this management and leadership thing because it was just so important. And anyway, so that's what I've been doing ever since is really trying to understand why people want to come to work, how they can feel engaged and have the impact that they want, and just create a really positive, kind, productive environment.
Love it. I love it. I love that you took your own experience and allowed it to fuel the future version of Robin and the work that you would do moving forward. As you know, we were discussing right before we started recording that we've had very similar trajectories in that we started out with that longer term corporate career, realized what we appreciated of it and what we didn't appreciate so much. And then we're able to take that experience and allow it to inform that next chapter of our career. So you said that you were doing everything wrong in that senior leadership position. For the benefit of our listeners, what are some examples of the everything wrong things that you were doing?
Oh my gosh, Lori, I have to tell you, I spent so many years really just ashamed of the mistakes that I was making. But I think at the time, I had been really an individual contributor, like somebody that, I took a lot of pride in my work. I was really responsible and, very proud of kind of doing high quality work. And it's, those are the kinds of things that we look for in, elevating people into management positions. And that's kind of what happened to me. But when I got there, I was so focused on taking care of my client and making my boss happy that a lot of times the decisions I made really came at the expense of my team. And it really was rooted in this attitude that I had at the time that they should just be thankful that they had the job and that they should be, really just responsive to whatever I had asked for. And it was just pretty negative. And so, things that would happen, I would say a lot of frustration when I didn't kind of get the work quality that I wanted, that would kind of come out in terms of being disappointed or frustrated with them. And it just created an overall kind of negative environment. And I tell this story recently. I did a TEDx talk, but I tell this story about things really came to a head. And on one Friday afternoon, 10 of my 20 employees quit.
Wow.
One after another. They came in with a single sheet of paper. It was a resignation letter, and they dropped it on my desk. And it
Wow.
took my breath away. I mean, it was devastating. And in that moment, I said, if I do nothing else in my career, I have to be a good manager. I have to figure this out. It was horrible. And so, and really, it was like coming back in the next Monday, I knew everything had to change. And so that's really when I kind of delve in more deeply to kind of the leadership development training. I got an executive coach for myself, and just really tried to turn my attitude around first, and tune into what people needed and wanted from their work, and just check myself, in terms of kind of with the energy I was putting out there. And so I am so proud that it took about 18 months to rebuild that team, and which we did. And now it's 10 years later, and even though we're kind of all in different directions, we're still very close, and I feel very proud of kind of the environment that was created after that really, really bad day.
Okay, I've got a few things I want to talk about. I've got notes here. If I'm looking down at any point during the interview, for those who are listening, you probably wouldn't be aware, but for those who are watching on YouTube, I look down a lot. It's usually I'm taking notes. I'm not making a crossword puzzle, I promise. One of the things that you were talking about is the, I guess, mind chatter that was at play, or some of the motivations of your behavior, or assumptions that were at play when you were that bad version of a manager. You said they should just be thankful they have a job. Something I've noticed a lot with different generations in the workplace, right? And just managing that multi-generational workforce, is that there are generations who are from a time where the economy was in a place that they had to be thankful when they had a job, and they were willing to tolerate a much higher level of command and control approach, or just inappropriate leadership behavior, because it was for them to actually assert themselves or say something about it, it could have cost them a job in an economy where if you had a job, you should be grateful because there weren't a lot out there. Unfortunately, in this day and age, it's a job seekers market, right? And
Right.
1 in 4 of your existing employees who are already in your employ are eyeballing that exit door. So with that in mind, I can see how many organizations are now motivated to pivot, to really train their leadership to take on a more empowering approach to leadership. You're not that you're not that seasoned of a manager, so I'm just interested to understand how, if you're not necessarily from that generation of be grateful you have a job, how some of these assumptions were floating around in your mind. What might have been
Oh,
motivating them?
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I definitely think there's a generational element to it. So I'm a Gen Xer. I'll be 50 in about a year and a half. And so I would say I came into the job market myself, at a time where, I did need the work, and I was certainly, let's say, like professionally raised up by people of that generation that certainly had that attitude. And I heard something recently that I think helped bring some clarity. And it was, one of the things, we're triggered by those things that we've learned to suppress in ourselves. And so I think what that meant in this context is, I had learned early in my career to not really, maybe ask for too much, or not to really stick out, or just to kind of be, to be compliant and kind of get by, and people please, really. And so then when I was in an environment where I had a whole entire team that did not come from that same mindset and felt incredibly empowered to challenge, what I was asking for, what we needed to do, it was triggering. And so now, I mean, on the other side of that, I can kind of see it more clearly. But in the moment, it was incredibly stressful. And that stress cycle just kind of really built up over time until it kind of it reached a head. But
I love that insight. That's absolutely. And I'm, as an FYI, also a fellow Gen Xer, who we were also latchkey kids, right? We were of the generation where both parents were, it was that first generation that both parents worked, and that was the norm. But to the point where the parents had been raised from parents from the Depression times. So they were still of that mentality. If you have a job, you give it your all, and you work that hustle culture, and you work those crazy hours. So we were latchkey kids coming home to empty houses and starting our own dinners. But I think that in and of itself also shaped us into some tremendously hardworking people ultimately. But I
Right.
love your insight about the triggers, because I agree that sometimes maybe we wished that we had had that voice back in the day, that we were able
Oh
to
yeah.
affirm ourselves, right? So I often say like jealousy and triggers in general are often admiration turned inside out. And
Yeah.
that
I
to
love that.
pause, you need to pause and think about what might actually be at play here. So thank you for that added insight. That was the first thing I wanted to tackle. And I love that you had a bit of a aha moment, but I would say be more of an aha moment when 50% of your team walks out on you. Uh,
Right.
can you walk us through that day and what were some of the things that were happening in your mind? How did your senior leadership react to that? What was that next? How did you take that otherwise completely earth-shattering situation and make lemonade with it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a great question. Yeah, that day in and of it, like that day itself I was just devastated. I remember like putting my face down on my desk. Of course the tears had started, and like my cheek like stuck to the linoleum of the desk because there was all the papers. And that's why I was like, at that point I kind of just needed to finish up for the day and kind of get out of there. I will say that coming back in, obviously I had to work with my senior manager to start to rebuild. And the amount of grace and support and encouragement that I got from that whole team was remarkable. They were 1,000%, I think there for me, like saw the potential and said, wait a second, like this is a moment. Let's learn something from this. And we're right there with you and we're going to help rebuild. And so I think that's why I can look back with it, with kind of like seeing the pros and cons of that situation, because it did become a growth opportunity where I felt really supported.
I love that. And I want you to share with our listeners I heard that your team was extremely, they were extremely supportive of your pivot and of you deciding to rebuild that team. What were some of the things that you had to demonstrate to the team? Because I'm assuming that there are surely some leaders listening to this podcast episode who have had, made some bad decisions as a leader. And so if you could provide maybe insight in terms of strategies that helped you regain that trust and that level of credibility and authority with your team, the existing team that had been there prior to when they were double the size, as well as with the upcoming team. So what are some of those leadership practices that you adopted that really helped you rebuild?
Yeah. Well, and the first thing, and it's funny to say on a podcast, but I had to stop talking.
Oh.
And I really felt like every meeting was my opportunity to just share everything that was on my mind and what I wanted people to do. And that was just crushing the energy and the creativity and all of that. So I had to stop talking and really just create some more space for that, like that two-way dialogue. I also, I think the other thing is there's so much in the work we do that there really is no one right answer. And so letting go of this idea that there was some kind of objective reality, there was some rightness to it, you know, and that right, and I was the only one that knew that. I had to kind of let go of that too and just open up some space for us to try some different things and get creative. So I think that's really it. I mean, the communications, one of the things I notice now, so like if we fast forward 10 years and the kind of work I do now, I do, coaching and consulting with people who are, in senior leadership positions. And I think there's like two things happening. One is that there are those kind of undertones of negative attitudes that still exist, and some, but people aren't really aware of them.
Mm.
We're now conditioned enough to know that we can't create a negative or a toxic culture, or we can't like outwardly shut people down. But there still are some undercurrents of just attitudes about like why people do what they do. So building some awareness around just what your attitudes are about your employees. But and I think the other thing is that leaders don't always know what to say. And so kind of back on this point about communication, I think when you stop talking and create some space for just asking good questions or just asking any question at all, and then you have this like two-way dialogue. But I think really kind of thinking ahead of time about what are some of the scenarios that are going to come up that we know are going to come up, like whether it's somebody coming in and asking for a raise or for a promotion, or somebody that is having a conflict with a colleague, or there all of these other leadership scenarios that come up all the time. Knowing what you think about it and kind of rehearsing a little bit in advance, like, what is your perspective? and thinking through how you want to deal with those situations can boost your confidence so tremendously as a leader that whatever happens, you're like, hey, I know this kind of, I have a go-to script, or I have a go-to kind of idea of how I want to handle this. So that I'm not struggling in the moment. Because I think sometimes when something comes up, and this was my experience when I was in that leadership position, I see people see it happening now, is that when, employees come to you with something, you're not prepared, there's this freeze, there's like this initial kind of knee-jerk reaction. It may or may not be what you really mean. And then we're left like trying to pick up the pieces and clean up after the fact. When if we had just kind of gotten ahead of it a little bit and thought through, like, how do I want to handle this? What do I want to say?
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes the more you are prepared, the less you'll avoid. I think procrastination and avoiding those harder, those more sensitive conversations tends to
Yeah.
happen when you're feeling ill prepared for them, right? So I love your advice to practice and to take the time to practice. Also love where you talked about increasing self-awareness, because that is key. My listeners who have listened to more than one episode are now well versed in the fact that I am a huge fan of Everything Disc, which is just one of many personality assessment tools that provide a profile of how you're wired, what are your innate preferences and tendencies and needs, but also provides the different styles that are likely showing up on your team, and how your approach to leadership and your approach to managing each of those different styles is landing differently based on their preferences and how they're wired. So love the idea of increasing self-awareness as a means of, as a leader, being able to better understand some of your blind spots and being able to prepare accordingly based on some of those to minimize the impact they're having, right, on your daily.
I love that. Yeah, for any organization that can afford, whether it's DISC or something like StrengthsFinder or any of those assessments, like both in terms of time and it's the financial investment is not, I mean, it's a little bit, but if they can afford to do it with time and money, it is so worth it. I mean, just to get that insight. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of assessments as well.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that you did mention is sometimes they just don't know what to say as a leader. And I think there's this kind of rooted belief that you have to have all the answers as a leader, right? So I liked when you said, learn to ask curious questions. Your role as a leader is to coach them, your team members, through that critical thinking process. You're not supposed to have all the answers. You are supposed to actively listen to them and get them to provide some of that input, provide some of those answers, but coach them and guide them into unearthing those solutions. I had a leader who was I was coaching through just a transition from one company to another they had acquired. And he was really frustrated with the fact that he didn't have all the answers for his team members. So I asked him, so what's your approach? He's like, I've just been avoiding the emails. If you would see my inbox, I've got like 300 emails long. And I'm like, wow. He's like, no, I'm fed up of giving them those same scripted. And I talk about the specific experience or example in the book. I'm fed up of feeding those pre-scripted answers that we're only allowed to give. And I feel like I don't have any other answers for them. And that's terribly frustrating for them. And to be honest, I'm incredibly frustrated. And I said, so share that. Because you've already seen that they're navigating this uncertainty. They've got all these fears at play, whether they're founded or not. Take this opportunity to normalize their experience, to be empathetic towards their experience, and to tell them, hey, we're all in this together. I'm kind of feeling, uneasy about the whole thing as well. And then to say, okay, how about you just shoot all your questions or all the assumptions that you're making about this acquisition, for example, and let's see which I can right away quash based on what I know today. And then for the stuff that I'm not aware of, I'll have on my radar in the event that I'm provided with added information that I can share with you.
Yeah.
Game changing, right?
Yeah.
It's not about, they're not thinking that they're not going to think he's incompetent because he took that approach. No, what are they going to think? That he's empowering. He's one of them. They'll feel like really supported by your approach, right?
Right. Yeah. And no, I think that's brilliant advice. And you're exactly right. I think there is this false belief that leaders need to have the answers, when in fact it's sometimes so much more effective to be like, I don't know. But you can't, it doesn't end there. But to your point, I don't know, ... And either here's how we're going to find out, or here's what the next steps we're going to do. or here's how we're going to work together. Like there's always like a little bit more
I don't know.
to go with it.
I like that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And here's what we're going to do about it. Yeah.
Right. So that's good advice.
You mentioned false beliefs. I like that. How about we've worked, both of us, with a lot of leaders. What are some of those false beliefs at play from a leadership perspective that you've had to have some of your clients kind of do some mindset work around?
Well, I think one of the ones that I bump into a lot is that the leaders, know what people want. And I find that there's assumptions made that, you know, because there's a career ladder, or because there are some financial rewards, that those are going to be sufficiently motivating for all employees. And so that false belief that they know is gets in their way, because as we know, I mean, people are motivated by just a myriad of different things. And simply having that conversation to really understand, like, what do you want? Like, what do you want? How can I support you in getting that thing?
Yeah.
It's rarely, it's really kind of exactly what we imagined it to be. And it never looks like our own path.
It
So,
doesn't at all. I like that. It's rarely what we've already preconceived it's about or what it's going to be, and it seldom looks like our path. That's amazing advice. So how do you propose they find out?
oh, well, I think they ask, and these are these one-on-one conversations that, I think many leaders kind of know they need to have. They might have them on the schedule. They don't necessarily stick to the schedule. They're often the first meeting that gets rescheduled when something like more important comes up. But at a minimum, I think once a year, especially before you do any kind of goal setting, is just to sit down and have an honest one-on-one conversation about, right, where are you? What's going on with you? Like, what do you want for this coming year? Like, how can I support you? Because I feel like then you can kind of go into a goal setting conversation, or, really any, but like you can go into a conversation like so much more informed. Because I don't know if you've had this experience kind of maybe back in your previous corporate life, where your goals are kind of like given to you. They're kind of talked down, and it's like,
Yeah.
well, here's your piece of it, and here's your
Yes.
piece of it. And I'm like, it was not inspiring at all. Like, I'm not, this isn't this isn't what I want. I can contribute in really meaningful ways, but it doesn't look like that. So I think really getting clear picture of kind of like just what employees want by asking them.
I love it. I love it. And what do you do today? You're doing your own thing, self-employed? So at what
Yeah.
point did you decide, and what motivated your departure from corporate? Just because we're kind of looping back to that corporate experience and that corporate history. And I forgot to ask you that. I've been curious about that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I spent about 20 years in, well, wait, was no, a little, maybe 15 years in kind of management consulting. I always kind of felt like there was maybe a broader work world out there that I wanted to explore. I absolutely loved, I love being in corporate. I love the training opportunities that provided. I love that community. I love all of that, that really low point that I talked about before. I had to recover from that in that environment. I couldn't have quit like that Monday coming back in and been satisfied at all. It would have just, so I just stay and kind of really recover from that. But it was maybe 3 or 4 years after that, we had rebuilt the team, and I felt like they were really off and like ready to go. And it was really time for me to move on and do something else. And after spending that time in my own, self-discovery and kind of my journey, I wanted to work with other people who might be in a like experiencing a similar kind of pain, because I feel like it doesn't have to be this way. If you're miserable at work, there's so much of a better way to do this. And I think through some training, some development, some coaching, that it's possible. And that's kind of what I see with my clients right now, just making these amazing transformations when they're kind of tuned into some of kind of these simple tactics for taking care of themselves and taking care of their people.
Love it. So simple tactics. Can we share a few that you've seen have been tried, tested, and true in terms of what are some of the things that you need to help your clients recognize on the regular, that for the benefit of our listeners you could share today?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things I like to, well, we kind of mentioned this before, but like really nailing those one-on-one conversations and knowing that they matter to the employee. They may not be top of your priority list, but they really matter to the other person. So getting those scheduled on some regularity and honoring that. In those, really opening up that space for that two-way dialogue, talking less, listening more, asking a lot of curious questions, I think are good. The other thing, and this is incredibly tactical, but it comes up in almost every conversation I have, which is just basic meeting hygiene and just keeping meetings really focused, on point, like agenda driven, knowing what you want to say, knowing what you want to get out of it, and keeping, because meetings are really like how we interact on like a daily basis. Most people hate them, but a really good meeting can create so much, such a great sense of connection and community and the sense of forward progress. Because I think ultimately that's what leaders want, is a sense of momentum, and that we're growing, we're moving, we're doing things, opportunities are being created. And that's what you can do in a really well run meeting. So I think kind
Yeah.
of getting some discipline around how they run meetings is a good tactic as well.
It's a good starting point. I absolutely agree. And it's usually one of the first things that are highlighted when you start to work with a broader organization is, we have too many meetings. Our meetings are
Yeah.
useless. Why do I have to be at every meeting? And sometimes when you restructure the way they approach meetings, help them understand. I've even done metrics in terms of, what's the cost of having this meeting? Like, if we think about the salaries of all these people who are sitting at the table, the hourly salaries, if we were to break it down, do all these people truly need to be there? So to help people convey the understanding of who needs to be at that meeting versus who's a nice to have, but also structuring the meeting so that it is highly productive. But when done well, it creates alignment. It creates so many beautiful things just from a team perspective, gets them connected, gets them thinking on the same page, right? Gives them an opportunity to have some productive debate. So starts to get them comfortable with a bit of conversation, kind of courageous conversations. There's so many good things that can come from them, but ultimately you need to make sure that you are providing the box for that to operate within, right? Like how can you structure it so that everybody understands the objectives of that meeting, as well as conduct the actual meeting itself and staying on point. Having
Yeah.
the parking lot for stuff that goes way off base, right? Having the parking lot not to say we're not going to talk about it, but this is not the intent of this meeting, right?
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. You got it.
Amazing. You've already given so many beautiful nuggets of wisdom for our listeners, for our leaders out there. One of the things I wanted to touch on is, when you did have that situation with your staff walking out and you're trying to rebuild, can you talk about how accountability from a leader's perspective, because it's something we often discuss in terms of the importance of being accountable as a leader to your role, but to your team members.
Mm-hmm.
How did accountability factor into your approach?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Say a little bit more, like when you think about accountability in this context, what are some things that come to mind for you?
Fine for me. So when I think about accountability in a situation where you were well aware that you had made some bad choices as a leader in the
Hmm.
past, that your approach to leadership wasn't necessarily the most optimal approach.
Yeah.
Uh, was there some level of kind of having those conversations with the team to say that, I admit there's some of my choices as a leader that were made in the past, and kind of owning those choices
Hmm.
as a means of rebuilding trust with the team, for them to see that, hey, she recognizes what might have went down, or what would not have went down, and is willing to take the steps to mitigate and to pivot her approach moving forward. But on the flip side, for the team members for them to hold each other accountable, and to hold you and accountable to them. Like, how did you rework
Yeah.
all? That's where I'm thinking with all this.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I appreciate the clarification. So I would say that really kind of gets to the heart of, I think, what had to shift for me, because in my mind, like maybe leading up to that point, I could kind of see where, you know, that didn't really go the way I wanted, but part of it was because of the way she approached it, or maybe like I had this whole
Hmm.
dialogue in my head that justified some of my behavior because there was this shared blame for whatever the situation was.
Hmm.
And there was no space for that after I realized that it didn't matter. It did not matter who did what or said what, because at the end of the day, I was responsible and I was
Hmm.
accountable to them, to our business. And I had to own all of it.
I love it.
And so that was the first thing, is really sharing that apology. And it's not just a one-time thing, I mean, you can come in and say, look, I've really screwed up, but, you know, describing for somebody like, here's what I'm taking away from this. Here's what I want to change. What am I missing? Where are my blind spots? Like, am I missing anything here? So, asking for some of that feedback, which is, I mean, to be honest, can really be gut wrenching to listen to it, but it's necessary. Now, some of that I would say with any kind of feedback that you're, asking, whether it's from a boss or from a peer or a teammate or whatever, it's always optional. You can kind of take what's useful to you and you can leave the rest. But
Always.
just asking for it is so meaningful, I think, for people. So yeah, so starts with the apology, this recognition that I was accountable for all of it. And really then starting to follow through, because the apology itself, or be that accountability, is really only as good as when you start to demonstrate it. And so when you hear that cliche about walk the walk, that's really what that is. At least it was for me, really saying like, I've committed to, keeping these one-on-one scheduled. I'm going to really I really want to hear from you. Please bring me issues. I'll listen. Then I had to follow through, even when I was kind of frustrated
Yeah,
and
you didn't want to.
still like, I don't really have time for this, but I had to rein myself back in, like, no, this is what I'm committed to. So yeah, there's some relearning. So, and I think that's the other thing that I would just, as leaders, we're all still human. So the idea isn't that you reach this point where you're emotionless, or it's only like you're only having these, positive, glowy kind of feelings about your team. Like, you're still going to have all of the range of human emotions. But with that self-awareness about the impact of your words and your actions, like, you can be a lot more intentional about how you show up, and kind of like what you keep on the back burner, and kind of like what you show. And it's still very authentic to do that.
I love
So
it. I love that you're pulling off the mask, saying you're still going to have these thoughts. I did not overnight wake up and suddenly, was completely into this servant leadership role with my team, right? No, you're still going to have those thoughts, but you'll be that much more mindful of the impact, like you say,
yeah,
of your words. Instead of walk the walk, what I use with my daughter is, say she's apologized 5 times for repeating the same thing. I'll be like, because she apologized, repeated the behavior, apologized, repeated the behavior. I'll
right,
say the best and most authentic apology is changed behavior. That's
yeah,
all I need. I don't need the words. I just need you to change the behavior and not repeat. Then
yeah,
I'll be on the shadow of a doubt. So I like that you understood and recognized the value. The last piece that I really love is the fact that you owned that being a leader comes with responsibilities. And there's an accountability that comes with it, and that the he said, she said, and who was the blame or who had motivated the outcome of certain is irrelevant.
yeah,
You're a leadership position. It is your job to carry that accountability to some extent.
yeah, absolutely. You got it.
Well, Robin, we like to keep these under, just over 30 minutes. I feel like we could definitely, I feel like this with every guest every week. I feel like I repeat this every week. I could keep talking forever. For those who know me on a personal level, they know that I'd actually be capable of that. Is there anything else that you would like, if you had to take everything we've talked about and all this amazing experience that you've got, and you wanted to offer one final nugget of wisdom to our audience, what would that be?
Yeah, the first thing came to my mind is just so much appreciation for this opportunity to talk with you and with your audience, and just this belief that I have that work can be as fulfilling, and these leadership roles can be as fulfilling part of our lives as almost everything else we do. And and really kind of giving it that space, creating, making it an opportunity to really develop yourself as a person, examine some of those assumptions and those attitudes that you have, and opening up, with that growth mindset to the, with the changes that are possible. And it could just be so rewarding. So I'd encourage people, like anybody who's kind of on that path and feels like they're eventually going to reach some point of some mountaintop of it. That's not really the case, because there's always more to do. And the journey is just so, I personally have found it so rewarding. So
Absolutely. Development is a lifelong endeavor. I agree. We heard amazing things to examine those false beliefs, some of those assumptions that might be at play in your approach, to not take for granted what your team needs, to take the time to ask them. But on the flip side of that, to ask them how they need you to show up, and to be open to that feedback. I loved your example of sharing how you came back to your team after that big earth-shattering experience, and you asked them, here's what I'm walking away with. Here's what I want to do differently and moving forward. Is there anything I'm missing? And giving them that opportunity to chime in. Amazing advice for leaders who might be contending with a similar situation, and just understanding the importance of fielding the team and asking them powerful questions, creating that and creating more space in general for two-way dialogue, structured meetings. I'm telling you, like, there was so much amazing stuff that you came up with, and I'm really appreciative for having you on this show. If people want to continue to connect with you, because it sounds like if they are struggling with some of these things, or they have hit that point where they think, you know what, I know I've made bad choices, but I don't know where to go from here, how can they connect with you to kind of support their journey in developing the next step?
Well, so I'd love to get connected on LinkedIn. So if you're out there listening, I would just send me a connection request, and I would just be delighted to meet you there. So LinkedIn at Robin Camarote. You can also find me on my website at robincamarote.com. And yeah, would just love to continue the conversation with anyone who's interested. So thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And we will ensure, listeners, that we have all of those links in our show notes. So make sure to reference them. And just in closing, I want you to think about all of this plethora of nuggets of wisdom that Robin has provided, and maybe challenge yourself to implement one of the things you heard, maybe three of the things you heard, maybe all of the things you heard moving forward, but take the time to digest and to crystallize some of this amazing wisdom that was imparted and make a plan to take action. Thanks for listening. Well, folks, thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guest, make sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. Want to continue the conversation? Then head on over to our social media platforms, all of which are also linked in the description, to keep it going. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.